Alright, so this is Exploring Motion and Interactivity through Adobe Edge, and this is Tech Bites for May 3rd, 2012. I am Joseph Labrecque, and here's a little information about myself. I work for the University of Denver as a senior interactive software engineer. I'm also adjunct faculty, and oh, look at that, Microsoft wants me to install things. There we go. And here are some of my publications and so forth, my Twitter ID. You can get in touch with me. I specialize in Flash platform development and also increasingly some work with Edge and other initiatives like that. Okay, so Adobe Edge. Does anybody here know a lot about Edge or
Read up
no?
a little bit.
Yeah. Okay, so Edge is, you don't all know what Flash Professional is and does? Sorta, kinda. So Flash Professional started out as a basic animation tool to animate specifically vectors around the screen and compress them to really small sizes so that they could be transferred over the internet on web pages embedded in browsers. It allowed for sort of rich visuals and things like that back when that stuff wasn't really possible over the web, over HTML and so forth. So Adobe Edge also has that same sort of goal, and people who are familiar with Flash Professional sort of see Edge as akin to Flash Pro version 4 or so, which is many, many years ago. It's like a decade ago, right? But it has the same sort of capabilities. It is a motion and interactivity application. So you can move stuff around the screen, and the thing about Edge that differentiates itself from Flash is that Edge produces its content using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, whereas with Flash, it produces a file format called a SWF, which is basically a compressed, sort of compiled format, right? And since it started out as an animation tool like that, and the years since then, it's expanded greatly to cover many, many other things. You can do full application development, server-side programming, mobile applications, all sorts of stuff with Flash. With Edge, it's just starting out. It's still on Labs. So Labs is it's a construct that Adobe inherited from Macromedia, and it's basically sort of a public testing ground for different things. So lots of times betas and things like that will be released onto Labs, and that's where Edge is right now. It's currently in Preview 5 on Labs. The first preview was actually released, I think it was August of last year, and they've released a new one every couple months and have made actually a lot of progress since that first preview. So if we have Flash Professional, and we can do all this stuff with Flash, then why do we need something like Edge? So these are all iPads on the screen here. Everyone knows, right, that Flash content, SWFs, cannot be displayed in the iPad mobile Safari browser, right? So that's a problem for a lot of websites, a lot of owners of websites, content providers, and so forth. They want to be able to do some of the same things that they've done in Flash in the past, such as motion and basic interactivity on websites, but they want to be able to target all of these different devices, not just desktop, but iPads and iPhones and things like that. It's obviously a huge market, and people want to be able to get on there using some of the same tools and the same ease that you can do with Flash Professional. So here's actually the prototype of Edge. This is the first version that Adobe showed off during Max, I think it was 2 years ago now. And this early preview, this prototype, was actually built in Air, so it was actually built in Flash, using Flash technology. Since then, they're using another platform to build it called Lua. But this was the initial version, and for anybody who's familiar with Flash, there's a lot of similarities here. Some of the tooling along the side, and it's got a timeline and so forth. Actually, is anybody familiar with After Effects? It's a video compositing software. from Adobe. Yeah, so the timeline down there in this prototype, it looks a lot like After Effects in a way the transitions are, keyframes and so forth. A lot more so than it would look inside of Flash Professional. So Edge today looks a lot different. It's still got those same sort of transitions, and you can see that down inside the timeline you can actually put transitions on all the different properties of an object. So you can see translation of X and Y, you can see position, scale, rotation, things like that, even color. These things can all be adjusted across time, across transitions, and those transitions can be staggered along the timeline. And we'll look at Edge in a little bit when we get to the demo. But there's many things that you can do through Edge that are also possible in something like Flash Pro. So talking about working in Edge, we've got some basic drawing tools. So these tools allow us to create rectangles, rounded rectangles, circles, which are basically heavily modified rounded rectangles with large radii, right? And we've got selection tools, transform tools, clipping tools, all sorts of stuff like that. The actual elements that you see here are basically divs. So I'm not sure what the audience familiarity with basic HTML editing is, but a div is just, pretty much a blank element that you can do whatever. It's completely unstyled, completely just, it's a block level element with no real properties inherent to it as far as visuals go. So these are little divs by default. You can use web fonts within Edge. So traditionally, you are sort of restrained to some specific typefaces. So Arial, Verdana, Georgia, things like that. There's only a very small set of actual typefaces that can reliably be used on the web. But this is starting to change with the font face tag in CSS. And even in IE6, the font face tag is actually supported. The difference now is that we've got all these other browsers that are also supporting this through CSS. And additionally, you've got a bunch of services out there. So you've got things like Typekit, which is actually acquired by Adobe. But you've also got free options like Google Web Fonts. And this is actually a Google Web Font that you see in the image right here. So being able to actually use any fonts in these libraries over the web, it brings a lot more sort of, what's the term I'm looking for, expressiveness to when you're working with type, right? And then you've got imported assets. So here we've got a transparent ping. You can also import SVG, JPEG, GIF, and you can actually, you can also bring in animated GIFs into Edge, and they'll actually animate by themselves while you're animating them along the timeline. So it's pretty interesting the things you can do with these basic assets. And of course animation, so using motion to change not only position in space, but also really any properties that you can adjust on an object, you can tween or transition through these transitions in the timeline. And then we've got some basic interactivity as well. So here you can see the Actions panel, and this panel allows you to do some specific JavaScript. So little things like some timeline commands. So I want the playhead to go to frame, or not frame, but 200 milliseconds, 2000 milliseconds, 0 milliseconds in my timeline sequence, jumping around the timeline, things like that. You can see here, open up a website in a browser, and there's a whole bunch of sort of preset snippets that you can apply to these different actions in different events like click, mouse out, mouse over, and even touch events for mobile. So something that's been added in this last preview is the concept of publishing. In all of the other previous versions of Edge, you weren't actually able to publish. You could create your stuff, and since it actually creates all of your content, using HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, you could just grab all that stuff and throw it somewhere and embed it into a page and it would work fine, but it wasn't really optimized for the web. So now we have these publish settings where we can specify, hey, we want to output this for the web, we want to use some frameworks to distribute our frameworks via CDN. You can see we have the option to use Chrome Frame for down-level browsers like IE. So Chrome Frame, if you don't know, it's a little plugin for Internet Explorer 6, 7, and 8 that somebody can install, and it basically uses all of the skinning and controls from Internet Explorer that somebody would be useful, except it renders everything using Chromium and WebKit. So it makes it very compatible. And it also optimizes all that stuff. So let's do a demo. So I'm going to open up Edge here. And this is what you see when you first open Edge. You've got this little welcome screen here, and it talks about what Edge does. Usually what you've got here are a listing of sort of what's new in this particular preview of Edge. So if we scroll over, we can see that Preview 5 adds things like the clipping tool, different easing mechanisms, publishing, and enhancements to the timeline and so forth. So we can just create a new project here by hitting Create New. And by default, we've got our stage properties here. So these stage properties include things like width and height. We can change the background color. We can, let's make it black. We can provide a composition ID. So composition ID is something that's generated automatically by Edge, but you can overwrite this and use your own ID. The idea of the composition ID, this is how the Edge runtime, which is built in JavaScript, how it targets the stage that you actually use to embed the Edge composition into a web page. So it's going to look for this specific ID when you do that. But if I called it something like, if I called it Terry, then it's going to look for the stage ID of Terry, and it's gonna use that for inputting the composition. So some other things we have here, we have the concept of a down-level stage, which basically allows us to create some sort of a, it's almost like alternative content that you would see in older browsers. So let's actually open up, I've got a custom down-level stage project here. So I'm going to open up this Edge file so we can see what that looks like. So I actually don't have any content in here, except if we go into the down-level stage, you can see that we have an image that I just built in Photoshop and just brought in here. The idea is that this is sort of like a poster frame that's going to be used if somebody's using a browser that does not support the Edge runtime. What's going to happen? They're going to see this. And you can see I've even been able to put a link on there that directs them to go and download Chrome. And of course you could direct them to any browser that you want, but I use Chrome in this case. So back over to our new document here. Let's actually go through some of the tools up here. So you can see here's our rectangle and rounded rectangle tool. And in actuality, the actual elements that both of these tools create are identical. The only difference is that when I actually do some roundedness to my corners here, when I implement this, what'll happen is if I actually use the rounded rectangle tool after that, you can see it remembers what's going on.
I think Maria has some questions for you, but I don't think you can see them on your screen.
Oh, no, you can if they're,
By composition ID, are you talking
Yes.
about a specific instance of or iteration or version of it?
A composition ID it's basically the ID on the div tag.
Okay.
So you can apply an ID to any elements in HTML. So you can put an ID on an image, on a div tag, on a paragraph, whatever. And it's a unique identifier within the document to be able to then refer to it or manipulate it through JavaScript later on. So it's how you know it's how it knows to talk to this specific element
Okay.
to do things with it, basically.
The same IDs that we use for CSS.
Yes, exact same IDs as CSS. That's right. So, yeah, so any of these divs here, you can see this is a div, and I can give it an ID itself. So the composition has an ID, and then each particular element that you are messing around with in Edge also has an ID. So I could call this, rectangle number 2 or something. And of course, you have to, you're constrained to, what IDs can logically be named. So for instance, I can't have a space in my ID. It has to be one, continuous string and so forth. It can't start with a number, I believe, things like that. So you'll notice when I actually do that, we have this Elements panel right here, and the Elements panel switches the ID of that element as well. So we can see it's a div, it's a managed element, which means it was created in Edge, and so can take full advantage of the Edge runtime, and it's also got this name now. And I can double-click here and rename that if I want. I can rename it over here. There's lots of ways I can actually adjust some of the properties of this thing. The properties themselves over here, we can see that by default, this is a div, and this is one element that we actually cannot change into something else. If I go in and create a text element on the stage, and it just created it as black, so let's go and change that. So this element, by default, it's just ID'd as text, so we'll just call this default label or something. You can call it whatever you want, but when you have a text element, you can actually change this to be a specific element in HTML. So, if I wanted this to be a P or an H1 or something. And the reason you might want to do that is because you can then target it through, more advanced CSS that you have in your actual document in your website. Usually div's fine. It depends on what you want to do with it. So we can see here that every time I click on a specific element, that things change, right? And actually, if I bring in an image asset, we can see that that's going to be different as well. So if I go in here, I know that, let's see, assets. So here's my little guy. Let's just drag him in there. And if you want to import elements like that inside of Edge, you can see I just dragged him onto the stage from my desktop, but you could also go File, Import, and do that as well. So now I've got 3 different elements. I've got text, I've got basic div rectangle, and I've got an image element. You can see every time I click on one of these, the properties panel changes because each one of these elements has a different set of properties associated with it. Okay? Now, some of the other tools up here, and then we'll look at some kind of timeline stuff. So we've seen all of these creation tools. We've also got the selection tool, which I've been using the whole time, and the selection tool allows us to make adjustments. You can see here in my properties panel, I'm adjusting the location, the width, and the height of this element. I can also change the opacity. I can change the overflow. So for instance, if I change the overflow to hidden for this element here, and then I grabbed my, my face, I can actually drag that and pop it right into that rectangle. And at that point, it's a nested element. It's nested within the rectangle itself. So you can see everything's kind of hidden around there. Sort of. It's not the type of masking that we'd really be familiar with coming from a Flash Pro background, but it's got some of the concepts down. So let's actually unnest him, so I can just pull him back out, just like that, and he pops right back out. That's what overflow does. We've also got the ability to change the background color and the border, so it doesn't have a border right now, but if I if I do this, we can see it does have a border. Let's make that green. And we can change that from solid to dashed, or just have no border whatsoever.
Joseph,
Yes?
is there a way to bring similar elements into some class and apply the properties of it to be affected?
So if you wanted a bunch of rectangle elements to all share the same properties, probably the best way to do that would be to create one exactly like you want it, and then you can just copy and paste it, right? There's another mechanism that Edge has that's also heavily borrowed from Flash Professional, and that's the idea of symbols. So if I take one of these guys here and I hit Control Y, it's going to create a symbol for me. So I'll call this oval primitive and hit OK. So now we've got even another type of element on here. You can see when I have the symbol selected, and this is a symbol instance, okay? Because symbols, if you look over here in the library panel, symbols actually reside themselves inside of that library panel. And when you bring, why can't I bring this over? I don't know why I can't select my symbol there, but I should be able to select my symbol and bring it over to create more instances. It is, you know, pre-release software here. But if I hold down Alt and then drag, I can also duplicate the symbol. So in that case, we can see here, and you can see as I do this, it's actually creating additional elements down within my timeline here. And from my timeline, I can toggle the visibility of these guys. I can lock them, and I can even right-click on them and, you know, do things like paste. So there's all sorts of ways of going about it. I can do many of the same things from over here in the Elements panel and so forth. But this is, if you make it a symbol, you know, that's sort of like freezing it in a way into a state where, okay, I want this as my base state for these things. And then as you drag out different instances of that, you can then make modifications on those. So this isn't ever changing the actual symbol itself. It's just changing the instances of those symbols. So the properties of those get changed through there. So I could change the opacity on that. I could adjust the rotation or the transform so I can scale the thing. All sorts of stuff. And that's only going to pertain to the actual instance itself. It's not destroying our symbol. So, you know, kind of two ways to go around that. And let's see here. I want to show the clipping tool, because clipping's pretty cool. It's almost like when you saw nesting earlier, how we were able to hide a portion of it. But clipping actually has a dedicated tool, and you don't have to perform any sort of nesting. If you're familiar with Adobe InDesign, you'll see this little content grabber. And the content grabber can be used to actually adjust the background position of our source image. So to kind of explain this, you can see here that this thing is a div, right? And it's also marked as an Edge image element, okay? So we could also change this into an IMG, which is the HTML dedicated image element, but either one is really fine. The thing to see here is this source points to the ping that's in our library under Assets. And with this ping, we can actually adjust the position of our element through this content grabber. So moving this guy around all over the place, you can see it shows me the point that I started from in that little green X there. I'm not sure how well it comes over Connect. But and then my little donut that I have up there, my content grabber, I can actually move it around and place it. I can also adjust my clipping rectangle here. So moving this clipping rectangle, I can actually hide portions of this. And if I wanted to, I could adjust any of this stuff over time. So I've got 3 minutes, and I don't know if I can go over or...
Well, you can, but people might need to leave.
Sure. Yeah. So let's go through this a little bit, because you want to see how to move a little something around, right? So we have sort of a unique mechanism for animation and motion inside of Edge called the pin. And you don't necessarily have to use the pin, but it's actually really useful. What the pin does is allows you to pin, using this blue playhead, a certain set of states along the timeline. So where the little blue pin is, everything that you see on the stage right now, before I do any animation, that is the point where it's going to look exactly like it does. We're pinning it right there. The actual playhead itself, this yellow bit, is actually where things are going to change. So if I grab my content grabber here, and I move this guy down like this, you can see that we have a transition now. We've got keyframes, and we can make adjustments to that. So I'm going to toggle my pin off, and then if we go through and preview that, we can see the background image position actually adjusting per that. And I've also got here a little ease tool. So by default, it's going to do just a linear ease from point A to point B. But I can actually change this to match any of these eases here. So let's ease out and do a bounce, because that's really that's going to be something that's very sort of dynamic. So we test it here, and you can see it bounces, right? So that's previewing stuff inside of Edge, but we could also go through, hit Control-Enter, and it'll actually bring it up in our web browser and preview it for us there. So I can hit F5 and just change that as much as I want. So to perform any actions on any of these elements, you can see these little scripty tags here. Clicking any of those is going to bring up an actions panel where you can do things like click and so forth. So that's how you access that. So let's go back to the PowerPoint, and I'll wrap this up. So that was our demo. So you can download Edge for free right now. You basically just go to labs.adobe.com, and you're able to just download the package for Mac or PC. Or I hate that. Mac or Windows, they're all PCs. And be able to install that and run it on your machine and play with it. And there's getting to be more and more tutorials and things like that out there. All the time they're changing stuff, so it's a little hard to keep up with some of the things. They might look different on some of the older tutorials than they do now, but it's a good thing that they're making such progress on the tool, because it really is a fun tool, and it's something that's kind of needed if you're doing this sort of interactive and motion work for web. And you can also use this in other things too. It's not necessarily constrained to web. Anything that supports HTML and so forth will be able to handle that. So thank you. This is my Twitter handle here. So if you have any questions, feel free to follow up with me using that. And I can stick around for any sort of questions that you want and answer that sort of thing. Let's have a look at the Connect session here. And I'll just kind of buzz through these.
And Joseph, if you don't
yes.
mind repeating any questions that come up either in the
yes.
room or on Connect, that'll be a full thanks.
Okay.
I actually have a comment.
I'm still in the chat before it even started, so it doesn't look like there's a lot. So stage ID, I addressed that. Yeah, composition ID and stage ID are the same things. That's right. Okay, so you had some questions?
Yes.
Yes.
I guess I was wondering if you knew whether what Adobe's intent with Edge is. Is it going to are they going to try to make it so that you can completely replicate modern Flash content on the iPad, or is it a similar but different technology?
I think similar but different is a good way to put it. I mean, there's there's a lot of things that you can do with Edge, but it's not nearly the amount of stuff you can do with something as mature and widespread as the Flash platform. I think that they're starting with these basic things, and they seem to be starting off with with a bunch of sort of their baseline is, here's some of the stuff that people were able to do with Flash for the web a decade ago. So let's start there, because that's what a lot of people want to be able to use on their websites and so forth. If they're not able to target iPads with some basic Flash content that has like just stuff moving around, right? Mm-hmm. Or some basic interactivity like Edge has. They can use Edge to do that. If you want to do anything beyond that, then you might be able to do some stuff with Edge along with a whole bunch of other JavaScript libraries. But using just Edge itself, you can move stuff around, and you can make it so you click on things, and some little things happen. But you can't build an application with Edge.
So you're probably more likely to see things like I guess a lot of design websites have a lot of Flash content, or especially architect websites have sort of Flash-based menus and such. You could replace that content with more friendly Edge content. Yeah. So you've got to look at what has happened in the past 3 or 4 years. So it used to be that Flash was really the only way to do a lot of really dynamic stuff on the web. But now that things have progressed, browsers have progressed, engines that run JavaScript have gotten better and so forth. So you've got a lot of the capability of some of the basic stuff that Flash can do that you can now do using other technology like HTML and JavaScript and everything. And for elements like that, it makes sense to use HTML and JavaScript, where Flash, if you need to build an application, if you need to build a game or something, Flash is a good choice for that. If you need to stream video or RTMP and everything, and use these crazy protocols and have all this functionality around it, Flash makes a lot of sense. Edge isn't going to be able to touch that stuff, at least not right now. Does that? Yeah. Yeah. So we're not going. I might have gotten more complicated. Yeah. Probably not going to see any Edge desktop tower defense things. Probably not. Edge can be used to create supplemental materials to use within larger kind of JavaScript-driven applications. So maybe you've got something, this application or this that does something, where Edge isn't really related to those core functions, but maybe some Edge elements are used within there. At least maybe a big banner advertising your application, right? So yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. No, it's one of the nice things about Edge, and it is really pretty intuitive to use. It's fun. So even if you're not building some great thing with it, it's still fun to kind of tinker around and so yes.
Do you have a sample presentation where everything is animated or something?
Yeah, sure. I pulled a bunch of stuff out, but I wasn't sure what I could kind of get to and so forth. But let's see. So I've got this one here, which is actually I should probably show this within Edge. But so this is an animation that takes advantage of nesting and sprites and layers and so forth. And it's very short, but it gives off a lot of these sort of motion capabilities of Edge. So if I open up the Edge file here, we can see, and unfortunately the projector kind of, or not a projector, but the LCD sort of squishes my real estate down here. But basically, if I do this, you can see that I've got a lot of smaller transitions here. So here's the creature itself, and I'm doing things like translate Y and X, scale Y and X, opacity, rotation, in order to sort of move it along these different lines. So you've got a lot of control over exactly how this sort of stuff happens. And if I click on each of these transitions here, you can see, so you see the little transition, the easing box right here. So here I'm using a ease out circ, but if I click on this transition, it's just a basic linear transition. I've got some others in here somewhere. And you can see you can select keyframes, you can select everything and actually make adjustments to it and so forth. There's my little donut again. But yeah, so that's, uh-oh.
Can you add sound to something?
It doesn't have any sound capabilities as of yet.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think I just killed Edge. So let's, there we go. Yeah, so there's that, and
Do you think this has to do with HTML5 development? Edge?
oh yeah, this is definitely one of Adobe's pushes for HTML5 tooling. Yeah. So here's a animated sort of ad for a book giveaway that I'm doing at D2W this next month. So, you know, basically I send this to people to kind of advertise my session, and you know, they get to actually see Edge in action, and you know, get information about the session, and you know, they can win a book and so forth. So,
Is this a server-based installation?
what's that?
Did you install it on your local machine and as a server, or C2.27.0 and your local host?
Oh, that open, yeah. So, yeah, it just does this. It does this. It uses its own port and everything that it just kind of, and I'm not sure exactly why it's doing that. I can't tell you why. But it definitely does some stuff and puts it in memory or something, because if I go through and I create a new Edge composition and I test it, if I go back here and refresh, it's not going to work. So it's doing something. I don't yeah. It's not something I set up though. Edge just does that. Yeah.
If you view the source code on this page,
Yes.
what does it look like?
So it's very simple. Here's my stage, and it's got my composition ID right there, and then I've got the Edge runtime, which is basically a little JavaScript include. So it includes this little preload JavaScript, which you know, lovely JavaScript here. What's that?
Is that a jQuery library?
It does implement jQuery. It relies on jQuery for some of the stuff. And actually, if we go into right here, so here's the published version. So if I publish web, so there's all the publish files. So you can see it creates an HTML file for us, which basically has that stage in there. We've got our Edge JavaScript file, which is it's the main Edge file. It pretty much defines any of the stuff that we're looking at. So if I go in here, so you can see it's including jQuery libraries here, so the easing and jQuery itself. Here's the Edge runtime, and here is our actual main JavaScript file. Oh, I can't edit that, can I? Maybe I can do it from here. Oh, jeez. I don't know why it's not letting me do that. Alright, so here's the main JavaScript file for this particular edge composition. So it defines things like all my symbols. So the stage itself is just one big symbol, you can see here. And if we go down, we can see here's my background wash. It's an image. Here's some particulars about that. Here's the image of the book. It's also an image. Here's the little speaker badge that I have on there. Here's my title text, cards text. So this format is a JSON format. So it's a JavaScript object notation. And it defines all of these different pieces and all the states. So this is actually the the animated sequence that happens for each of these elements. This instructs. So here's the timeline. So you wouldn't want to edit this by hand, you know. So yeah. So are there any other questions about?
I think you got everything I had.
Okay. Yeah, and really the best way to check it out is just to download it and play with it and so forth. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything I need to do?
You've got to stop the recording. Actually, I can do that too probably because I think I'm listed in here as host. I got to stop sharing.